What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of my favorite Ironman challenges, or hardcore challenges if you prefer, but I've always referred to them as Ironman myself. And essentially that is basically any game where the goal is to defeat it without dying, or whatever else the fail state for the game you're playing happens to be. So essentially things like permadeath, where, failure basically means starting over from the beginning in its entirety, and for longer RPGs that can be a really daunting task. And while these challenges are hardly anything new, some games make that a more interesting experience than the others for one reason or another. And after recently completing a run of Pillars of Eternity 2's The Ultimate Challenge, this has been on my mind a little bit, and I was thinking about other games that I had completed interesting challenges like that, and thus that's what we're here for with this particular video. Kicking things off with a little game you may have never heard of, and that's Divinity Original Sin. Not 2, mind you, the original game. Though I admit I myself am guilty of occasionally forgetting the existence of this one, as it is almost rare to see a sequel so totally eclipse the original, to the point where most people don't talk about Original Sin at all. In spite of that though, I have actually covered the game a fair bit, even if I've never personally got around to reviewing it. I did actually make a whole story series for it back in the day, but one of the achievements for Divinity Original Sin is naturally to beat the game in honor mode, or an Ironman version basically. But what makes this challenge really unique is that, like basically any other Ironman challenge, you can absolutely learn the game in and out, where to break it. Original Sin has a lot of the more interesting mechanics you can put together to break the game the way 2 does as well. The weight mechanic is especially broken as an example. But that's actually not fun at all. You see, the easiest way to complete the Original Sin honor mode is actually to just speedrun it. And while it's not what I would consider like a completely laughable experience in terms of difficulty or anything, you still have to understand what you're doing and why. If you're willing to take the time to learn how this game works, you can understand how people go about speedrunning Original Sin 1 pretty easily. Basically, it involves abusing that weight mechanic that I mentioned, but also the game's teleportation pyramids, which have been a long-running thing in the series that allow you to teleport over long distances. But Original Sin also has a bug that allows you to use those teleportation pyramids to much greater effect than would be typical, to effectively skip most of the game's content, and you do like one dungeon that is mostly without enemies before using the weight mechanic, a bunch of barrels stuffed into a chest, in order to completely decimate the final boss in just a couple of hits. I've personally done this a few times. The last time I checked, I have no idea what it is now, but at the time at which I had done it, I was about 10 minutes behind the world record. It's one of the only games that I've actually made like legitimate speedrunning attempts at, but it was really cool to take a game and learn so much about it and everything it's got going on content and story-wise, and then for that last final achievement, do something entirely different and break that game again in a brand new way. And that's why I enjoy it so much. Now, in a somewhat, I would say, polar opposite example of that, we have potentially the most boring entry on this list, to be honest, and that is actually Expeditions Rome and its Ironman challenge. So, truth be told, there's nothing really spectacularly special about this. If you really wanted to, you could even throw it on the easiest difficulty and complete it that way via Ironman, but if you've watched the channel a long time, you may be aware that my 2022 Game of the Year was actually Expeditions Rome. I really enjoyed it. And the reason it is on this list is simply because that game has such a fantastic blend of CRPG elements like, party members that you'll get to know over the course of several war campaigns, elaborate stories surrounding them, and of course all the adjacent history stuff like dealing with Cleopatra, but also, perhaps more importantly to this video, it's turn-based combat, and they did such a good job of taking something that could have been honestly not all that interesting and giving you a bunch of different ways to make that combat more exciting than simply swinging swords or spears around might normally be. So the reason I enjoy this one is simply learning all of what this game had to offer and then utilizing that knowledge to execute an Ironman run as the sort of final send-off. So again, is it terribly difficult or anything like that? Not really. It was just a really satisfying send-off to my otherwise great time with that game, at least before the DLC wound up coming out. And while it's still not terribly likely, I am hoping that one of these days we do get another Expeditions title. That brings us to number 3 though, and maybe not the most shocking entry, we actually have Baldur's Gate 3 and its honor mode. So I covered this game a bunch when it released, and all throughout its many patches. I'm still waiting on the new patch with the 12 new subclasses, but like a lot of people, I really loved it. And you can actually go back and watch my videos where I was pretty vocal about how the game could honestly stand to have a bigger challenge. And it would definitely seem that Larian listened to the entire community on that one, because they implemented the very well thought out Honor mode, an Ironman mode on a special difficulty though. You see, Honor mode doesn't just make it permadeath, but rather it adds the special mechanics unique to that difficulty mode to various bosses and the like. And while I believe now you can actually alter them, at the time I did it, you couldn't just use those on, I think it was Tactician. I want to say they added that afterwards, but it's been a little bit. But with the way Baldur's Gate 3 operates fundamentally, taking that and then forcing you into a single save file on top of the natural RNG that comes with just rolling the proverbial dice, it has a few unique things going for it. For starters, Baldur's Gate 3 is a very open-ended game, which means when it comes to tackling a challenge like that, you really have just so many options at your disposal, which I talked about in my own video about it after the fact. Like, for instance, once you get to Act 3, there's really only like one boss you have to kill if you've set yourself up properly. And I think even that one is technically skippable under like the exact right conditions. And even since then, people have come up with all sort of self-imposed challenges to knock out this mode on top of everything else you can do. So not only is the base challenge really impressive, but it is so malleable in the way they've implemented it that you can do all this other crazy stuff at the same time. And it's a really rewarding experience. And the end result of that really, and the reason I enjoy it so much, is because you're pretty much going to wind up with a unique story every time. For instance, in my own honor run that I got my golden dice with, I had been using Lae'zel because she is a fantastic fighter, but she died to a bad roll like halfway through the run, and I had to completely reprioritize things. And that's definitely the kind of thing I absolutely would have reloaded for previously, but here I was forced to just, deal with it or lose the run. So then going on to manage and make that run successful came with its own unique story that I'm not soon to forget. And pretty much everybody that has a successful run with that is going to have something like that to tell you about it. And I think that's just so remarkable, which is why it's on the list. But that does bring us to our number 4 entry, and this is actually The Witcher 2 and its Madman achievement, which is beating the game on insane difficulty, which is basically permadeath. And now this is an interesting one because I actually did the vast majority of the 100% on The Witcher 2 right around the time it released. I played the original Witcher all the way back in high school, and the second one launched not all that long after I graduated. So naturally, I knew I wanted to play it and do as much as I could, which, involved running through it and seeing all of its 16 endings. But the one thing I left undone was actually the Madman achievement. And that is because if you've ever played The Witcher 2, it's incredibly wonky hitboxes and the like, and likely the dialogue events where you can just be unceremoniously murdered. Now, those weren't actually what I struggled with. I had actually made attempts on this all the way back then, but the issue was the dragon fight towards the end. I kept just getting wrecked by that. And I didn't really have time at the time to completely dedicate myself to getting past it, which is why when I decided to review the series last year, which I had obviously played extensively before then, I knew I wanted to finally knock out that achievement, and that unique experience is really what it's doing on this list, because I think it's not a fair challenge at all given the state of how combat works in that game. But taking something that I was already really familiar with and then, knocking it off my bucket list by finally finishing it like a decade later, after video games had become my job, was just a really cathartic experience overall. And as you may have noticed, over the past couple years, I've been really trying to dig into things that I've left unfinished or things I've always wanted to do, like Pillars of Eternity 2's The Ultimate, which brings us to our number 1 spot, The Ultimate. So just for the record right now, at the time of this video, I'm in the process of getting this run confirmed, which I've explained in a few videos, but to keep it brief, The Ultimate is an official challenge by Obsidian. Only, I think, less than 20 people at least have actually finished it, because it involves recording the entire run and then sending that and the save file for the run off to Obsidian, where they'll go over it and verify all of it. I've sent it all to them. I'm waiting to hear back. So the run is done. It's just not official yet. But it's definitely going to go down as one of my favorite experiences Ironman-wise, just because of how much went into it, as it's no small feat. You see, it's not just an Ironman mode, but rather you have to do that Ironman mode solo with 11 other small challenges associated with it that modify the gameplay in some way. These can be things like just straight up obscuring most of the numbers, causing the food you need to provide to your ship's crew so nobody starves or mutinies on you, to rot constantly. You're up against a timer that's ticking down in the background. You have to beat it before a certain time. Your armor can break and decay. You also have to protect a little girl throughout the entire run, which is the by far hardest part, and it's an extreme challenge. So any attempt at all requires a very, very detailed level of knowledge about this game. And in spite of that, there is actually a pretty common method associated with doing it. It's just so challenging that even if you know what that method is, it's still a very difficult thing to do, which is why the completion numbers are so low. Well, at least part of the reason anyway. And I was actually, still playing Pillars when they formally announced this challenge, like all the way back in 2019. And I remember at that time really wanting to do it, but knowing very well I'd probably not have the time to ever be able to do that, especially back when they straight up said they weren't even sure if it was possible. But now, obviously, all these years later, where I had the time to get this done, and having visited their offices back in November for a preview, where I got to see the plaque for the first 12 people who had completed it, really sort of lit a fire under me to get this done. And I'm really glad I did. It was crazy. Even with all my experience, I just barely managed it, finished that run by the skin of my teeth, and it is legitimately probably going to go down as one of my greatest personal accomplishments when it comes to gaming, and it doesn't really get much more memorable than that. So naturally, it tops the list. But that, I think, is where we're going to end this particular video. So if you have any other Ironman challenges or just gaming challenges in general, I suppose, that you really enjoyed, I'd love to hear about them down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.